Welcome everyone to Screams After Midnight solo Shudder review edition. I've not quite figured out the perfect title for this yet, but that's okay. This is the little sister show of Screams After Midnight, where I, on my own, am working my way through Shudder exclusives. Usually sticking to the newer ones unless there's a quiet week, and we'll go back and do an older one. This episode, we are talking about Blood Vessel. Is a film which is listed as 2020 on Shudder. It's 2019 on Blood Vessel. Like a lot of the films that end up as exclusives on Shudder, it's probably, and I'm just double checking this as I talk, it's probably just a case of it was at some film festivals in 2019, but it was really 2020 when it got released to the public. So I would say this is a 2020 release. You know, if I was counting this for, best of lists and worst of lists at the end of the year, I'd be counting it as 2020. Which list could it make? You're going to get an indication in a second. So, what is Blood Vessel? I'll start spoiler free, of course, as I always do. Blood Vessel, the description on IMDb puts it as the following: lifeboat survivors lifeboat survivors board a German boat that is crawling with vampires during World War II. What's interesting about that description on IMDb is that the description on Shudder did not mention vampires. I didn't actually know when I started this movie that it was going down a vampiric path. And that came as kind of a sort of gradual realization and surprise. Although I would argue that they're not straight vampires. There's a lot, they're definitely vampire-esque. There's a lot of vampire imagery, there's a lot of vampire stuff going on. But the rules are a bit specific. It's not like every vampire rule applies to this. It's not everything that is typical of vampires is here. It's a more monstrous take on vampires. It's a bit closer to, say, a Nosferatu-esque kind of thing than your suave Dracula or anything like that. But yeah, so it's an allied boat of refugees or of just a shipwreck. Is it the description on Shudder called it a hospital ship? That does not sound like the right term to me. I feel like a medical ship, or I don't know. I've never heard the phrase hospital ship before. It sounds wrong. But we don't even see what happens to them. We don't get the backstory really outside of they were on a ship and now they are stranded on a lifeboat. There's like about 8 of them, give or take. And it's a really hodgepodge of characters. We have a couple of English characters, we have an Australian character, a couple of American characters, and a Russian character. And there may be one or two that I've glossed over because they're not as memorable. And what's weird about it is some of the accents are a little bit weird, and they come off feeling a bit odd. I couldn't confirm if the one who seemed to be trying to do a New York, maybe kind of Brooklyn style accent. It didn't say on IMDb where he was from, but there are at least 3 or 4 of the other main cast are actually all Australian, despite the fact that there's only one actual Australian character. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this was shot in some capacity in Australia, or it was Australian funded or something. Because it definitely came across that way once you started to realise that a lot of the cast were Australian. But yes, so it's set in 1945, so right towards the end of the war, and they're stranded. They're arguing about food. They already have been stranded for some time because they've run out of food, and lo and behold, a boat appears, a ship, and they're all excited until they see the various Nazi symbols and flags and whatever kicking around, and they're like, oh crap. So they cautiously still board it because ultimately they don't really have a lot of choice. They're stranded in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What are they going to do? And they get on board, and it's it follows the beats of a lot of other things. It follows the beats of something like Aliens, with them coming down to the planet and sort of seeing the aftermath of something bad that has happened. They get on the ship and the crew just aren't around. There's a couple of dead ones. There's like a dead captain, like sitting in his chair. There's a couple of other dead bodies around, but it's mostly empty. It feels like something eerie happened, something bad happened. And of course, as it goes on, we get to the actual horror of the danger they're in throughout. It's very Resident Evil to the point where it even feels like a big deal a couple of times when they find a weapon, when they find a working machine gun, or they find an axe in someone's dead hand, and it's like, oh, this feels like a video game. It feels like I just found a weapon, and all of a sudden they've leveled up and they can defend themselves a little bit. But there's a lot of things that correlate to other stuff. At one point, I even thought they were going to have a Newt-like character from Aliens. When I was watching it live, and it was one of the viewers who said, "Oh, I bet this character's not actually this. I bet she's Newt." And for a good, a little bit of the movie, it kind of feels like it's going that direction. But then it kind of swerves back a little bit, because horror. And I don't think that's much of a spoiler, to be honest. So before I, obviously I'll save everything else for spoilers, but in terms of, enjoyment, is it good? Is it worth watching? On episode 2 of this Shudder exclusive journey that we're now going on, it's not a good movie. In fact, I would definitely say it's a bad movie. It's not the worst movie. It's not the worst bad movie. What I said upon finishing it, as soon as the credits rolled, is that it feels like a movie that you stumbled onto at 2 a.m. on a movie channel on cable. Or maybe not the movie channel, maybe the sci-fi channel. But I'm not saying it's like Sharknado and things like that. I'm saying it feels like a movie of a different era. It feels like a movie that you got in the 90s when they were doing these things for relatively cheap, and they were just, on late night TV constantly. That's that type of movie. That's what it feels like. With pretty mediocre acting. I wouldn't say it's garbage acting. It's just really mediocre. It feels TV movie-esque in terms of the acting quality. What is surprising, though, the one thing that kind of felt a bit above the rest of the film, bizarrely, was some of the practical effects. I'll just say that there was a fair bit of makeup involved with the vampires themselves, and that looks surprisingly pretty good compared to what the overall quality of the rest of the movie was, which typically felt fairly cheap. Whenever it did an exterior shot of the ship, it looked kind of rough. It looked kind of just like a little CG, a little too CG. But the vampires look pretty good, and it was funny is that discovered after the movie that the director of this film, Justin Dix, is actually an award-winning special effects coordinator or supervisor, which kind of explains why the practical effects are quite good. Whereas everything else, whenever it uses CG fire, whenever it uses, these other things, it tends to waver a little bit. But some of the practical effects, there's a couple of kills as well that are fairly solid. And that's definitely the best thing it's got going for it, which, again, is kind of what adds to the feeling of what I was describing, where it feels like the sort of random movie that you rented in in Blockbuster or wherever in the 90s, based on the title, based on the cover, and it was mostly pretty shit, but you did have a couple of good kills or some good effects to kind of make it worth the time. That's kind of the feeling that I got from this, which is not to say that I recommend it. If you have nostalgia for that era, maybe a little bit. I don't know. It was okay watching it with other people. If you don't know, I always watch these Shudder movies for these reviews on stream with the live audience over on the other channel, Male Fuzz TV Live. It's a separate channel just for the streams. We tend to do that on Thursday nights, but I think having the fellow audience there helps. I think having some people to sort of like joke about some stuff and comment on what's going on makes it a little bit of a better experience. And it's definitely not the worst type of movie that I've in terms of the stuff that we've covered on the streams, we have done much worse than this. This is watchable. It's watchable in that kind of really mediocre, but it's knocking off, it's ripping off a lot of movies that are good, or it's ripping off a lot of things that are good. There's a bit of Aliens in here, or a bit of Resident Evil, a bit of these other things, but then you've got the vampire element, and of course you have this whole, the Nazis were into the occult kind of thing, and that's why it's on a Nazi ship. Is kind of part of the backstory. It's watchable. It's watchable. It's forgettable. It's not something that's going to leave that much of a mark, outside of one or two positive qualities, all pretty much pertaining with the practical effects. The characters are bland, and they don't really ever go beyond that. They're basically flat out unlikable. The main sort of dude who's the Australian, he is maybe a little more likable than everyone else, but even the other characters who are supposed to be likable kind of get on my nerves. They're just a little bit grating. Not too much, but just a little bit grating. You know, we're supposed to sympathize with the one female character, well, other than the girl that's on the ship, but the one female character of the main group who is, you know, a nurse or a doctor from the previous ship. Like, she was just kind of annoying and like overly British and a really. In fact, speaking of the British characters, the other guy, the Faraday, who's kind of the coward, whiny one, also over the top British accent, and like I said, the New Yorker has a really over the top accent. So there's a lot of like really over the top, dodgy implementation of accents in this, which is maybe one of the reasons why I found them kind of just annoying more than anything else. Yeah, maybe that's why the Australian guy comes across a little bit better, is because he's actually using his real accent. That said, though, they don't get away from the cliches, because despite the fact that they were all like in the war and they were all in the ship because they were shipping home or they were injured or whatever, this Australian still has like an Australian style hat on, and I thought that was kind of weird. What, he was allowed to wear that when he was fighting in the military? What? Or the navy or whatever? You know, whatever. I don't know. Like, it doesn't. They never really go into what any of these people were actually doing in the war. There's like one brief mention of him being a prisoner, being a POW, basically, and other than that, there's like almost nothing. There's like one scene where they all kind of like show off a scar or two, like a bullet hole here, you know, kind of thing. Other than that, there's almost nothing about who these people are, who they were. The only thing in this very same scene as the bullet holes, there's a little bit brought up about who has family. So, you know, one guy has a wife, someone has a kid, someone lost their spouse and their kid. You know, the nurse, for example, lost her husband and her daughter. Her daughter was in the Blitz. That's where she died. Her husband was a soldier who died in Africa. Like all like that's basically it. Like, I basically just summed up in about 30 seconds everything we ever learn about any of these characters. And there's not really any interesting bonds that are formed. The closest thing they try is that everyone's kind of distrusting of the Russian, but he's actually one of the more capable characters. And him and the Australian dude kind of, it's like they have a slight bond, I suppose, but it felt like there could have been more to it than that. The biggest problem with the characters, I think, more than anything, is just that it feels like they're going through the motions most of the time of what this type of movie is supposed to have them do, as opposed to actually taking the time to really build any of them or make us care about any of them. Everything's just kind of, okay, checklist of scene where the guy who they don't trust does this, or the scene where one who is kind of nervous does this, and it just feels like it's going through the motions, and as a result, all the events with the characters just feel kind of hollow. And it makes it really hard to remember a lot of the beats of this. You know, sometimes I'll go through the movie kind of in order when I get to spoilers. Sometimes I don't, depending. Just whatever fits the movie at hand. With this one, there's no way I could go in order. I watched it, like, I finished the movie maybe 2 hours ago, if that. And I don't think I can recount the sequence of events in order. I can give you the big tentpole moments. I can give you the spots, the big high spots of the big turning points, but in order? Nah, probably not. So that's kind of my spoiler-free thoughts. It's not good, but kind of watchable in a late night cable 1994 kind of way. Not that I was watching stuff like this in 1994. I was 5, but by the end of the 90s, I was. So yeah, so I'll give this the spoiler. Although I'll take this time to thank our Patreon producers for the month. So thank you to Tyler Hess, Cindy Palacios, David Sharp, Board Now, Al Treisman, Christopher Moy, Brett Williams, and David Brown. That's our Patreon producers over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, where you can go over and support us as well. You don't have to be a producer, though, of course. You can support us for as little as $1 per month, and $1 per month is amazing in its own right. It is more than we would make if you watched every single ad on every single video that we put out in a month. So never question that. However, if you can't give that, don't worry either, because liking is super important, subscribing is super important. These are all things that help the channel spread to new audience members, to more eyes. So don't discount any of that. So thank you for your support, and I will get on to spoilers for Blood Vessel. And it's a good title. And it's one of those things, when I realized it was a vampire movie, or something like a vampire movie, the title was even a little bit better, because beforehand it was like, okay, blood vessel, you've got the double meaning of, blood vessels in your body, and a ship, a vessel of blood. There's blood on the ship, blood vessel, right? But then once I realized, oh, this is about vampires. Oh, okay. Now it makes even more sense than it did before. I won't quite say it's a triple meaning, because it really just ties into the whole blood vein thing. As in, blood vessels, blood. You know what I mean? It just ties into that, but it made even more sense at that point. As far as going through the big beats of the movie, there's the nurse is actually bit in the hand in the first scene where they introduce the girl, and it's kind of like, the veins are starting, or I should say the vessels are starting to like bulge, and it's clear something's happening later on. And eventually, once like the other vampires wake up, because the girl turns out to be the daughter and basically the sole perpetrator who has killed the entire ship. Although, much like good survival horror, and one of the things I love about stuff like Aliens and Resident Evil, and by Resident Evil I mean the games, not the movies, is the idea of like, okay, something happened here, and some actions were taken by the crew, and they discover through some assumptions, recordings, diary entries, whatever, that basically, like, the captain of the ship took them off course so that no one would find them, because the idea that these vampires could never be unleashed upon the world, or that'd be doom. Even the evil Nazi ship captain was like, no, we can't let this into the world. I'm taking us off course, and killing myself, and that's it. But of course, the idiots decide to like go snooping around, and they find some treasure on the ship, and the New York guy's really excited by that. But ultimately, looking for more treasure, the New York guy opens. He just thinks it's a chest, and I was immediately, because they get some like old like film footage of all this stuff leaving the museum, and there's a couple of big crate looking things, and that's what they say they are, and I'm like, bitch, please, those are coffins. That is a fancy. I mean, it's a fancy, like, expensive gold and jeweled. Like, this thing costs tens and maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it's a coffin. And sure enough, he opens with his greed, looking for more stuff, and basically the way I described the head vampire, the male vampire, was I called him Man Bat, because that's what he looks like. He's got big bat ears. His face is like a big giant bat. He's a humanoid bat. So it's definitely vampire-esque in that they do react to blood, but a lot of the other rules aren't there. There are reflections, although reflections might reveal that when they're faking human, because they can sort of fake looking human, and not even that. We find out later on that they can outright pretend to be someone else. They can sort of make you hallucinate, which is kind of, again, it's kind of an extension of an actual vampire thing. Not in every vampire, work of fiction, but in a lot of vampire mythology, some movies, some TV shows, some books, whatever, you get vampires who can, glamour their victims and sort of put them into a trance. It's kind of an extension of that, where the vampire will make the person see like a loved one who's died or something to try and trick them. It's also kind of a ghostly thing, but it's very monstrous. He's a big bat-looking creature. And then the wife, when he eventually breaks her out after he kills the other dude, is, she's a little bit different. She's not quite as bat-like. She's a little bat-like, but she doesn't have the big ears. So, different again. But honestly, this makeup and prosthetics look quite good. This was the surprising moment of the movie. There's also a really good kill in the middle where someone basically hacks a head off, and it takes like 4-5 like good hacks, and it feels kind of like they're hitting with the neck with a blunt item, and it's just kind of gradually happening. That looked quite good as well. So those are the kind of the standout kind of moments. The character stuff, I mean, there's like some tension between the New York guy and the other kind of like American cook character, who dies very early, and notably as a black character. And I did kind of note that he was like one of the first characters to die, and it's one of those things where it's such an old trope at this point that I can't help but notice when it happens. And I don't know if he was the very first. There may have been one before him, but it was very early. You have him. The New York guy dies when he wakes the vampire up. um, it's not that long before it's established that whenever one of these vampires has bit a person, it doesn't matter which one either. It can be the daughter, it can be the husband, the wife, whatever. But if one of them in the bloodline has bit a human, then the head vampire dude, he can like control you, and kind of Renfield-esque, where he's kind of like because their blood's now in your system, it can kind of take over a little bit, and you can kind of fight back, but ultimately doesn't necessarily always happen. And that's kind of like ultimately by the time this is going on, like the main character's like, okay, we kind of have to we have to blow up this ship, we have to stop these things from ever getting out. And that was where the movie like really I already knew throughout almost the whole thing what sort of level of movie it was. I was never under the impression that it was maybe going to become something great past a certain point. Right from the get-go, the dialogue and the cliches, they were just already there. I knew what sort of level we're dealing with. Other than the surprising effects at a couple of points, I knew it wasn't going to like punch above its weight. But the confirmation that kind of encapsulates that is when we get to the moment towards the end when really the only surviving two, kind of, and I'll get to the nurse character in a second separately, but we have the Australian and the Russian, and they're kind of like bonded a little bit, and they're like, look, we just have to blow this thing up. We can't let these things off. Let's do this. And they shake hands or whatever. They mildly embrace in some way. And the Russian's been bit at this point, so he's like, you know what, I'm going to have to take this down with me. I'll stay here and blow everything up. And that's fine. So this moment of heroic. But I never felt the weight of them making this choice. It just kind of felt like, okay, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do now. I never felt that these characters were making a choice to then fight back because they realized what was actually on this ship and how apocalyptic it would be. Like, there's a version of this story that could be perfect. That if you gave this to like a really slick director, if you gave this to someone who would really build the tension, and I'm thinking, obviously not now because he's way past his prime, but I'm thinking like Prince of Darkness era John Carpenter. Like, there's something here. There's something here, and it could be special, but and again, it's not that these other elements haven't been done better elsewhere before, much better, in fact. But there's something to be said here. One of the points that the streaming audience pointed out as well was that it's a very diverse cast of like characters on this lifeboat at the start, and obviously they're all fighting on the same side in the grand scheme of things, but it's kind of an interesting mix of like how did this eclectic of a mix of nationalities get together. It's not like all the squads were all completely mixed amongst all the allied countries when they were fighting in World War II, so it's a little bit weird. They just they wanted a nice mix of characters, I guess, so you can overlook that for the sake of a little diversity, say. But yeah, so don't really feel like that. But the weird thing is that at the end of the movie, when it's these two run around on their own, and eventually the Australian finds the nurse, and he's like, come with me, this place is going to blow, and they jump off the boat, it explodes behind them, it's this big thing. So there's a moment here that feels like it's supposed, like, it isn't, it's not meant to be, because it's clearly not been concealed. But there's a moment here that in any other movie would be a twist or a reveal where it reveals that she's already a vampire and she bites him, he dies and sort of sinks almost Titanic style, like Jack at the end of Titanic, into the water, and she's saved by the passing British ship, and now it's like, oh shit, like the ending is really like depressing because the vampire bloodline is into the world and she's going to spread it and we're all doomed. And it even ends with a bit of a ironic joke where she goes, this bloody war, eh? Very British like, but the joke being blood, bloody vampires, yeah. But the thing is that the movie at multiple points, like, it's one thing for us to know that this is coming, and I would argue that even then, I don't think the way it's played on the build-up to this happening feels like we're supposed to know, but we do. It just kind of feels off in that way. Because as soon as he finds her and he's like, no, we have to get off, and it just, I don't know, it feels odd. But we know at this point that she was already lured in because she was already bitten in the hand. Remember, she was bitten in the hand by the girl in the first 20 minutes of the movie. And about 2/3 through or so, She's lured into the lower decks where the vampires are, and he lures her in, and I'm thinking she's going to go full Renfield, but he actually just bites her. And I thought, okay, so he's biting her and he's killing her. But so when she shows up at the later on in the movie, and she's okay, it's like, oh, he's made her a vampire. We know this as the audience. I still don't think the movie plays out at this point with the right sort of like air of like, oh, when's she going to strike? When's she going to reveal things? It feels like it doesn't do that enough anyway. But the other problem here is that in her absence, when these other characters have been doing their thing, and it wasn't just the two of them, there was like maybe another third or fourth, and then it's been whittled down to two, while she's been missing. They've actually discovered in that time that the bites lead to infection, that the bites lead to you becoming one of them, that you become a vampire. And that's why the Russian says, I've already been bit, I'm screwed anyway, I'll stay back and blow things up. So when the Australian guy finds the nurse, he completely forgets that she was bitten at the start of the movie. Because that wasn't a secret. Like, they all saw her get bit. No one knew at that time that there was any vampires. And even once they did know there was like something like vampires, they never really seem to know what a vampire is in the traditional sense. They don't instantly know what to do. They don't know how to fight it. They're looking up the weird book of like Nazi fairy tales to like figure it out. Very Book of the Dead-esque. There's like a case with like holy water, like grenades essentially, that we see it used once. It's not super great. But I mean, the effect looks good. Like when it gets smashed into the vampire's face and it's kind of like sort of clinging, there's the bits like peeling off. That looks quite good. But he doesn't throw it like a grenade. He just kind of smashes it into his face, which is less exciting, I think. But she got bit at the start of the movie, and they've figured out in the meantime that means that you're going to become a vampire and that you're screwed. And you can kind of argue it that he's just caught up in the moment. He's forgotten that bite happened, and he wants to save her. Because he's kind of bonded with her a little bit, and he wants to save her and not be the only survivor. But it is kind of a weird thing where, like, not only do we know that she's been completely bit and turned, everyone in the movie knew she was bit earlier on. So I don't know. It's a little bit weird. It all just feels a little odd, and like, there's a lack of tension when he finds her and they're running out, because you know she's going to be a vampire. It's just a question of when she's going to strike. And that could be good. That could be like a when is she going to do it kind of thing, but it's not played like that. It doesn't feel like it's played like that. It's too busy with the action of the explosions and the running and the jumping to ever really let it sink in. There's never a quiet moment where you have a chance for her to be like, oh, is she going to do it? Is she going to do it now? So that's kind of weird. So that was one of the big things. Some other details I think are worth mentioning. The vampires do speak to each other in an ancient language, and we get this like super old school kind of font for the subtitles. Kind of cheesy, but and the voice for the vampire is also actually a very cheesy kind of generic voice. It's the kind of thing I'd expect on. And I say this lovingly, but it's the sort of thing I'd expect on like a sort of B-level episode of the hit television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That kind of thing, kind of a cheesy demon voice. Another thing is that this movie's full of Chekhov things. And what I mean by that, if you're unfamiliar with the phrase Chekhov's gun, it simply means that if a gun is introduced in the opening act of something, that by the end it's going to need to be used. Someone's going to fire it because it's been introduced. And it doesn't have to be like first and third act, of course. It can be set up at any point and paid off at any point. But there's a lot of things in this movie I kept saying, oh, there's Chekhov's gun, there's a Chekhov's knife, there's a Chekhov's this, there's a Chekhov's that. And I laughed towards the end because earlier on in the film, like the cook, the one who dies early, he used to be an engineer, and he says, oh wait, this ship's engine is going to is going to blow essentially because it's running too dry and there's been no maintenance. It's been running without a crew for however long. And he wants to turn it off, and there's a debate whether or not he should or not. But in the event he does, he turns it off because it's the right thing to do, and it's too dangerous to leave it on. In the third act, when they decide they want to blow up the ship, they say, "Hey, so and so told us about the engine. We can overload it. We can blow up the ship." And I actually just laughed out loud that even that turned out to be Chekhov's like engine, Chekhov's overload. I don't know. There was a lot of that, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not even saying this is a critique because good writing sets things up and pays things off. I guess it's just almost a little too on the nose and on the surface that it keeps doing it. Like, just sort of set a thing up, pay off, set a thing up, pay off, as opposed to something that feels a bit more natural and feels a bit. And you can still recognize it if you're kind of paying attention for it and looking for it. But, yes. I guess what I'm saying is that this rating is, like, extremely just serviceable at times and no more. And then at other times it's not even that. At other times it's just far too mediocre and by the numbers. And then other times it's just a little serviceable. And that's pretty much it. It's a very, very lackluster affair overall. So I mean that's pretty much it. I don't think I want to drag this one out anymore. It doesn't have quite the crazy stuff that last week's movie did to go. But the vampire looked good. And a couple of moments with the vampire makeup or a killing here or there looked not bad. But that's pretty much it in terms of positives. And it's not a complete and utter painful train wreck. It's just mediocre otherwise. So when it comes to rating this thing, I mean, it's kind of a weird one because what I've described sounds like it's like 5 out of 10. But I don't think I want to give it that. I think it's just a little crappier than that most of the time. Despite the fact that it has the one or two good little elements to kind of rise it above, I am going to go with a 4.5. I would say that the movie as a whole is like a 3.5 to a 4, but the good vampire makeup and a couple of good kills kind of rises it up. I don't think it quite gets to that middle line though, because I think middle line, you get to that average territory. It's just a little less than that, but it is watchable. It's not painful. At least when you're watching with others. Maybe on my own, I might have a harder time with this, but we're going to have worse. There's definitely going to be worse. I've definitely seen worse on Shudder exclusives, so we'll see where we go from here. So, if you made it this far into the review, put the word "manbat" into the comments to let me know that you did so. You can, of course, like and subscribe, like I said earlier, very important, as is patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. Of course, you can catch us on the Twitters. You can get Screams After Midnight on Twitter at Screams Midnight. You can get myself on Twitter at Wibble89. And of course, at Mailed_Fuzz for everything MailFuzzTV, including all the other non-horror stuff that we do and everything else. So that is us. So that is me, I should say. I'm so used to it being more than me, but that is me. So thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching scary movies, guys, and we will see you next time.